All right, here we go. We have Peter Schiff, financial investor and entrepreneur who predicted the 2008 financial crash. Welcome to VladTV.
Oh, thanks, Vlad, for making me a part of VladTV. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this is our first time actually sitting down, so I want to get into your whole story. So you were born in Connecticut.
Yes, I was. Way back in 1963.
Correct. And I guess your father was the son of Jewish immigrants from Poland?
He was, yeah. In fact, they immigrated to the United States around the turn of the 19th century, and they found their way to Connecticut because my grandfather was a carpenter, and he got a job helping to construct the Yale Bowl. And so he moved out there, and then he stayed there and lived his entire life there. He raised 8 children, including my dad. I always talk about the fact that my grandfather came here, 12, 13 years old, no money, didn't speak any English. But when he got here, there were no welfare workers, there was no government assistance, there was no minimum wage, food stamps, none of this stuff. But he was able to get a job, eventually get married, raise a family, without any help from the government. My grandmother never had to work outside the home. They didn't have to borrow any money on credit cards or take out any loans, yet they owned a home, they owned a car. Eventually, he even had a beach house in Connecticut. He never did anything more than just work as a carpenter, although he was self-employed for a while, had a couple of assistants, but everything was in cash. And he lived his entire life, without really, having any of the assistance that we claim is necessary now. But it's interesting that you can't do that anymore in America. I mean, my grandfather, not only didn't he go to college, he didn't even go to high school, yet he was able to support my grandmother and 8 children without any help and without taking on any debt. Yet he still owned a house, a car, and all that. And so, why can't we do that today? And the reason is because we have a lot of government today that we didn't have back then.
Well, your parents actually divorced while you were still young.
Yeah, my parents separated. I have a brother who's a couple years younger, so I was about 5 when they separated.
Okay, so your mom gets divorced. She has 2 kids. In terms of your upbringing from that point on, do you think that your family was struggling or they were middle class and doing okay?
No, I mean, we weren't struggling. I mean, my mom worked. My dad really, didn't pay enough in child support so that my mom, could just stay home. So she had to work, but my dad did, contribute to, the costs. But, my mom managed to ultimately make a good living, and we ended up living in some pretty nice places throughout the course of my life, although we did move around quite a bit because my mom moved around. So, we moved down to the city initially. We moved out of Connecticut. We moved to Manhattan. And then my mom moved us all down to Florida, where her parents were, so they could kind of watch us while she went off to work. And eventually she moved back up to the city and then out to Southern California. And that's where I ended up graduating from high school.
Okay. Now, your dad was, I guess, what you would call a tax protester?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people call him a tax protester. In fact, there was a whole tax protest movement. And I guess for a while, my dad, maybe he was the leader of it or the most well-known of the so-called tax protesters. I mean, the government liked to label people like my dad tax protesters, or even they would say illegal tax protesters. But what my dad was protesting was the illegal manner in which the government went about collecting and enforcing the income tax. So my father didn't protest legitimate taxation. He may object to high taxation, but he wasn't protesting taxes that he believed were being legally imposed or legally collected. But he was very convinced, based on his own studying of the Constitution, of various Supreme Court cases, and the Internal Revenue Code itself, that the government was collecting, enforcing the income tax illegally. And so that's what he was protesting, government illegal activity.
Well, and you've seen a lot of people over the years try to do that. They try to say that technically, you're not required to pay taxes, or, I remember there was a movement that if you came from Africa, you technically didn't owe taxes, or if you were a descendant of slaves or so forth.
Yeah.
But ultimately, these things never really work out.
Yeah, well, they worked out for a lot of people. My dad didn't pay taxes for a long time, maybe 10, 20 years before he actually had any problems with the IRS. And that was only because he started going on television shows talking about the fact that he wasn't paying. But when he was just not paying, they basically left him alone. Even though he wasn't hiding, my father told the government that he wasn't paying and why he wasn't going to pay. And they pretty much left him alone until there was a lot of pressure, because he was being very public about what he was doing, because his goal was to try to force the government to obey the law. It wasn't that he was just trying to get away with not paying taxes. He didn't want the government to get away with breaking the law or violating the Constitution. And in fact, it's hard to really get into all the aspects of my dad's view on the income tax. But, one of the books that he wrote, called The Federal Mafia, one of the interesting things about this book, as far as maybe a potential trivial pursuit question, is there's only been 2 books in all of American history to have been banned by the U.S. government. One was Fanny Hill, and that was banned because they considered it to be pornographic. I mean, it would be, nobody would consider it pornographic by today's standards. But back then, it was pornographic, and so the U.S. government banned it. The other book was my father's book, The Federal Mafia. The U.S. government actually banned him from selling that book. But it's not illegal to buy it, and it's not illegal for me to sell it. It was only illegal for my father to sell it. So we still have some copies. If people want to go to schiffbooks.com, I don't have that many left, but I've got a few of these books. And if you read that, you'll understand my father's case against the income tax, and why it's based on voluntary compliance. It's not an accident that the government describes compliance as being voluntary. It's voluntary because it's optional. And the reason it's optional is because if it was compulsory, it would violate all sorts of laws, the Constitution, the Internal Revenue Code. So the government makes it optional, makes it voluntary, because if something is voluntary, well, then it can't be illegal. But then the government tries to enforce it as if it was mandatory. But you got to really read through his book, and you can look at all of his arguments and decide for yourself. But regardless of whether or not you are convinced my father is right, my advice is ignore anything he says about don't paying taxes, because I've always paid the income tax my entire life, because I recognize that the court system is corrupt. And so even if I believe my father, I don't think that the courts are going to be honest. I don't think that they're going to apply the law against the government the way they should. So, even though I think that I'm not legally required to pay taxes, I've always paid them. Now, I don't pay a lot of taxes anymore because I've moved to Puerto Rico. That's something else that we can discuss. So by living in Puerto Rico, my tax obligation has been considerably reduced. So, I'm not paying a lot of taxes. And that's kind of one of the ways I'm able to, accomplish that, not by having a legal battle like my dad did and end up in jail. I'm playing by the rules that the IRS, will respect. And one of those rules is if you live in Puerto Rico, there are some considerable tax advantages that you're able to take advantage of.
Well, I mean, like you just mentioned, your dad ended up getting 13 years in federal prison.
Yeah, he was in jail 3 times, but the last time he was in jail, he got, I think, like a 12 or 13 year sentence. And when you're already 70 years old, or whatever he was when he got the sentence, or 75, 76, 77, he died in jail at the age of 87, right? So I think he was 10 years into his sentence. But even after he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, we still couldn't get him out of jail. In fact, he died handcuffed to a hospital bed. They wouldn't let him out. And really what my dad died of was skin cancer. He got skin cancer that the government doctors didn't even bother to treat. And so it ended up spreading out through his entire body. He'd probably still be alive today. He would have gotten out of jail by now had the government not allowed him to die. But that's another example of why you don't want the government involved in healthcare. Because when the government provides healthcare, it's horrible. Because my father was basically incarcerated in a government hospital, yet he died of skin cancer, right? A private doctor would have cured it very easily. My father was very healthy otherwise, but left to government care, he basically died from the equivalent of malpractice.
I mean, yeah, I've had skin cancer. I had it on my face once. It was
Yeah.
a little 30-minute operation. They cut it out, and then you're done.
Yeah, but what would happen if you just left it there and did nothing?
Yeah, it would have killed me.
Yeah, so
Right.
yeah, that's what the government did to my dad. So he ended up getting the death penalty for, exercising his constitutional rights.
You end up going to UC Berkeley, where I went to school as well. Although
Yes.
you went a few years before me. Go Bears. And you got a finance degree there.
I did. In fact, when sophomore year, that's when we won the big game at Stanford, where we ran through the tuba player. So I was able to witness that live in the Stanford Stadium.
Okay. And then after you graduated, you became a stockbroker?
Yeah, not immediately after graduation, but within a few years, I ended up as a stockbroker. Yeah, I started working at Shearson Lehman in downtown Los Angeles.
Okay, and that's the Lehman Brothers?
Yeah, well, it was. I mean, Lehman Brothers merged with Shearson. It became Shearson Lehman Brothers. So by the time I worked there, they had already merged.
Okay, and then later on, Lehman Brothers was one of the casualties of
yes,
the financial
ironically,
collapse.
yeah, they went away after the 2008 financial crisis, which is something that I warned was coming for years. And in fact, had the people at Lehman Brothers followed my advice, they would have actually profited handsomely from that crisis, because instead of being long subprime mortgages, they would have been short, because I had been advocating that for years in some of my conferences, in the things that I was writing, in my book, my first book, The Crash Proof. I specifically warned about the housing bubble that the Federal Reserve had inflated in conjunction with bad government policy from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and I specifically identified the problem in the subprime mortgages, and was recommending my clients to short these mortgages. Eventually, the movie The Big Short was based on that trade. It wasn't based on me, but I made the same trade that the movie was about, and I was advocating that other people do it, and I was advocating it very publicly. So yeah, it's too bad that nobody at Lehman or Bear Stearns, because those are a couple of the firms that went away. And I used to work with Bear Stearns as well. I wasn't an employee, but when I first started my first broker dealer, I cleared with Bear Stearns. So I was working with both of those firms that ended up going under.
Right. Okay. So then in 1996, I guess you acquired an active brokerage firm, and you named it Euro Pacific Capital?
Yeah, that's how it come. So I was working as an employee of Shearson Lehman as a stockbroker, account representative, and I didn't really like their investment strategy. I wasn't really happy with the culture of the firm that really was centered more just on doing what was right short term for the company and for the institutional clients. And I was just working with retail, and I just didn't like the way my clients were being treated in that system. And so I just wanted to be my own broker so that I could pursue my clients' interests as best I could. And so I just kind of wanted to go independent. And I did something that it really is impossible to do today for somebody in my circumstances. And I started my own broker dealer. And the reason I'm saying it's no longer possible is because the regulatory burden has been so substantially increased since then. I mean, there was a lot of new regulation after 9/11, when we got the Patriot Act, and then we got anti-money laundering and all this stuff. And then after the financial crisis, more and more regulation. So I would need millions and millions of dollars to start my firm today. I didn't have all that money back then, but I was able to start it. And it's unfortunate that the government has made it impossible for people to do today what I did back in 1996.
Well, I mean, today, Euro Pacific Capital has a bunch of different offices across the U.S.?
Well, what happened around the time I moved to Puerto Rico, I ended up selling Euro Pacific Capital. And so the company was renamed Alliance Global Partners by the new buyers. And one of the reasons I sold it, apart from the fact that I was moving to Puerto Rico and I didn't really want to hold on to a US-based business living in Puerto Rico, but I really needed more economies of scale because the regulatory burden had been growing so dramatically over the years that in order for the broker-dealer to really be profitable, it needed to be much bigger. And I just didn't have the time to grow the business to the scale that it needed to be in order to meet all the government rules and regulations. I mean, the government has put so many small brokerage firms out of business because they make it impossible to stay in business because you don't have the scale to afford all the compliance. So these guys bought it from me, and now they ramped it up and they hired a lot of people and they're doing a lot of investment banking. And so they're big enough to afford the compliance. And so I still kind of left the Euro-Pacific brand over there as a division of Alliance Global Partners. And I'm affiliated with that division in that I am managing investment strategies for that division from my Puerto Rican company, which is Euro-Pacific Asset Management. That company is based in Puerto Rico. It was initially started in Southern California, Newport Beach. And in 2014, I relocated the entire business and all the employees to Puerto Rico. And a few years later, I joined them in Puerto Rico. And I've been living here full time since January of 2017. And I also manage a family of mutual funds, Euro-Pacific Fund family, from this asset management company here in Puerto Rico.
Well, at one point you started a Euro-Pacific Bank.
Yeah, I still have Euro-Pacific Bank, but I have a problem with the bank, and so I'm in the process of really transitioning it because there was a television network and newspaper out of Australia that accused the bank of doing a lot of bad things, and all the allegations were completely false. There wasn't a kernel of truth to anything that they wrote or anything that they said, but the mere allegations have created a huge problem for me in that business because of the regulatory environment that we're in. Just being accused of money laundering is enough that people can't work with you because now they're worried about their own compliance and being accused of working with a money launderer or somebody that's helping others to, evade taxes or, traffic in narcotics or whatever these crazy allegations were. So, yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that that article came out. I mean, I will be, getting my my defamation suit filed against that company. So yeah, that's moving forward, but that'll probably take a couple of years to play out in the Australian court system.
Let's talk about this for a second, because starting your own bank, that seems like such a monumental task from someone like myself that knows very little about this. You actually started your own bank. Like, how much is really required to start your own bank?
Well, you got to be pretty foolish actually to start one. Under normal circumstances, it wouldn't be that difficult. But again, it's government, it's the regulation that makes it difficult. I have to spend millions of dollars a year on compliance. More than half of the bank's employees are just compliance, right? Basically doing work for the government, not doing work for me. The minute you have a bank, now you're, in involuntary servitude, and most of the work you do is on behalf of the government. It's not on behalf of the bank, and it's not on behalf of your customers. So I would not recommend that anybody get into that business. The brokerage business is not quite as bad, but it's got that in it. I mean, it was much better to be in the brokerage industry when I first started. It's very difficult. I mean, the government is screwing everything up as they're taking away all of our freedoms and all of our liberties. They are loading up American businesses with all sorts of costs. I mean, that's why the U.S. is so uncompetitive. That's why we have record trade deficits right now, because we can't produce, because the government has so increased the cost of production in the United States with burdensome regulation that we end up importing stuff that other people produce, and we run up these huge deficits. Eventually, the dollar is going to crash, I think sooner rather than later. And then we're not going to be able to buy anything. We're just going to be broke because everything is going to be too expensive to import, and we don't have the ability to produce it ourselves. And so Americans are going to see a very substantial decline in their standard of living.
Well, and I want to cover all that.
Yeah.
That's very important. But I just want to kind of touch on Euro Pacific Bank for a second, because you mentioned that there was a TV show called The Age. Well, no, I get which is, I guess, the Australian version of 60 Minutes.
Yeah. Well, The Age. And The Age is a publication that's owned by the same company, Nine Media, whatever they're called, that also owns 60 Minutes Australia. And I'm not sure what affiliation 60 Minutes has, but 60 Minutes Australia may have with 60 Minutes the US. I mean, I don't know if they licensed the name, but it's a totally different company. It's not, CBS, the United States. But yeah, they're the ones that ran this article on me. And personally, I think the motivation, and I addressed all the allegations. You can watch my YouTube video. I put up a video. I think about 130,000 people have watched it. It's about a 90-minute response to those allegations. And so I think you just go on YouTube, Peter Schiff 60 Minutes, and you'll see it there. But I think that the reason that they did this is I think that 60 Minutes was working with the Australian government to try to create some public outrage and demand for more regulation on Australian banks, on Australian lawyers, on Australian professionals. And in order to do that, they wanted to create this fiction that Euro Pacific Bank was this bad bank, because we were doing business with a lot of reputable companies in Australia. And they were trying to say, hey, all these reputable companies are doing business with this shady bank that's doing all this bad stuff. We need more regulation in Australia to prevent this from happening. Except Euro Pacific Bank wasn't a shady bank. We weren't doing any of the bad things that they accused us of doing. They just made it up in order to advance this political agenda in Australia. And they figured, well, who's this guy, Peter Schiff? I mean, he's not going to sue us. We can say whatever I want. He's all the way over there in Puerto Rico. And so we could use him. We could sacrifice his brand and his company to advance, this political agenda in Australia and, maybe make some money, from our production. But, they underestimated my resolve. And maybe they even underestimated how much damage financially their false allegations would end up doing to the bank.
Well, I mean, according, to this article that I guess got put out on October 18, 2020, The Age said that Euro Pacific Bank became the target of the Operation Atlantis, the world's largest tax evasion probe.
Yeah, and to my knowledge, that's not true. I mean, we've never been a target of anything. I'm not even sure who the target of Atlantis is, that investigation. In fact, The Age, I think 60 Minutes, said that they weren't told who the target was. They guessed that it was me. Or they guessed it was my bank. Now, I don't know based on what information they guessed that. But, they didn't just, allege that we were the target. They said that we were the primary target, that the whole investigation basically was built around the bank, and that they basically said the bank was guilty, and they made all these false allegations. But I go into all the allegations that they made and why they were false in my video response. So I would suggest if anybody is really interested in that, they could kind of listen to that because it's already up there on the internet.
Okay, so let's just kind of go back a little bit. You started your bank, it was doing well at the time. And then in August 2006, you had an interview and you said, the United States is like the Titanic and I am here with the lifeboat trying to get people to leave the ship. I see a real financial crisis coming for the United States. He said, and you forecast that in 2007, that the real estate prices, which had peaked, are going to come crashing down to earth.
Yeah.
So in 2006, why did you think there's going to be a major financial collapse in the coming years?
Okay, and first of all, this is, long before the bank came around. And the bank doesn't even take U.S. customers. So those warnings, didn't apply to my bank customers because my bank customers are predominantly European. It's where most of them come from. But back then, I was very worried about the U.S. economy because I understood the mistakes that the Fed was making under the leadership of Alan Greenspan. They had kept interest rates much too low. And in so doing, they inflated a bubble in real estate. And the government was helping to fuel that bubble with mortgage guarantees, whereas individuals could take out mortgages at artificially low rates, and then the government, through Fannie and Freddie, would actually guarantee the lenders that the loans would be repaid, even if the borrowers didn't have the means to do it. And Wall Street then was able to get involved, creating all sorts of packages with teaser rates and securitizing mortgages to make credit even more plentiful and cheaper and more widely available. And Americans were taking all this cheap money and bidding up real estate prices. But in addition to that, they were also using their homes as ATM machines because the prices kept going up, and they would extract equity and go out and spend it. And all that extra spending was artificially boosting the GDP as people bought stuff they couldn't afford with money they really didn't have. And I knew this was going to end in a disaster, especially for the people holding the paper, the lenders, the banks, and anybody who had loaned money, because I knew that eventually the real estate bubble would pop, real estate prices would fall, and then all these loans would go into default. And then the lenders wouldn't get their money back, and the whole pyramid would implode into a financial crisis. And that is exactly what happened. And I warned in advance about what was going to happen. And I tried to get people to prepare for that, to protect themselves.
Okay. And you mentioned the movie The Big Short. Did you actually start to short the real estate market at that point?
Well, I didn't short the real estate market. We shorted the bonds, right? That's what The Big Short was. It was shorting a particular tranche of securitized subprime mortgages. And so we did that, but in a small scale, because again, most of my clients were not wealthy enough to qualify to get into that hedge fund. Government made it very difficult for people to participate because you had to have a lot of money and it was very complicated. And so not that many of my clients got involved. I mean, some of the clients got involved. And they did really, really well in that particular fund because the mortgages that they were shorting basically went to zero, and we had sold them above par. But what I was really concerned about was that after we had this collapse in the real estate market, after Fannie and Freddie went bankrupt and all these banks failed, my concern was that the government would repeat its mistakes, lower interest rates again, print a bunch of money to try to reflate the housing bubble, reflate the stock market bubble, and that in the process, they would destroy the value of the dollar. Now, it turns out that that forecast was premature. They did everything wrong that I said they would do. Quantitative easing, 0% interest rates, I predicted all that, and all those were mistakes. The Fed never should have gone down that road. It only did it because it wanted to kick the can down the road. It didn't want to have to deal with reality or the consequences of its prior mistakes. And so it made even more mistakes to delay dealing with those consequences. So I was right in understanding the mistakes the government would make following the financial crisis. And then they tripled down on those policies following COVID. But what we haven't had yet is the dollar crisis that I anticipated would be the consequence of that reckless monetary policy. I still think I'm right. We're going to have a dollar crisis. It's just going to happen later than I thought, but it's going to be even more catastrophic than I thought because the bubble is much bigger. The problems have grown much larger during the last decade of can kicking.
Well, leading up to the financial crisis, which it technically started in 2007 and spread into 2008. By 2008 is when, the banks started to actually go out of business and things started to really collapse. And before that happened, people were calling you Dr. Doom.
Yeah, that was CNBC started calling me Dr. Doom back in 2005 when I started talking about all these problems. And of course, after all the problems that I was warning about, all those forecasts came true, they basically stopped having me on. I mean, it wasn't immediately, but they gradually phased me out, and then they stopped inviting me back. So, they only want the people who get it wrong to come on.
Right. And, after the crash happened, places like Business Week said that you were more or less accurate in your predictions.
Yeah, there was a brief period of time where the mainstream media did give me a lot of credit. I mean, not everybody in the mainstream, but there were some people. A lot of people tried to tear me down. They tried to claim, well, I was just a stop clock because I had been warning about it for years, which was true because the problem was building for years. It didn't just happen overnight, right? The real estate bubble inflated over time. The Fed's monetary mistakes took a while before they blew up. So the fact that I was able to warn early about the mistakes and the impending consequences didn't mean I was a stop clock. It just means that I understood the problems. The stop clocks are the permabulls who never see the problems, who think everything is great, who think the Fed can do no wrong. And those same people are around today. All the people that I used to debate on financial television in 2005, 6, and 7, warning about the financial crisis coming, who told me I was crazy and everything was great, those people are still there. They're still telling everybody how great it is and how there's nothing to worry about. But now they just don't have me to point out that they're wrong anymore.
Well, in September of 2009, gold was below $1,000 per ounce. And you predicted that gold would go to over $5,000 an ounce. You fast forward to 2021, 12 years later, gold is up, but it's at $1,800 currently.
Yes.
It never hit the 5,000 that you predicted.
Yeah, we haven't got there yet. And it got up to 1,900 was about the high. And remember, it started the run from below 300 in 2001. So gold had a pretty big run before topping out in 2011. But when I was making that forecast of $5,000 gold, and I didn't really put a time limit on it. I said in a few years, and I would agree that it's been more years than I thought at the time. But back then, I thought the dollar crisis would have already happened, and it didn't. And gold's not going to go to $5,000 an ounce without the dollar coming under a lot of pressure. Those two are going to happen at the same time. But the reason that hasn't happened is because the Fed has been more successful than I thought they could be at delaying this, at fooling the world. And they've had a lot of help from foreign central banks that have also been making a lot of mistakes that have helped the dollar look better, by comparison. So the game has gone on longer than I thought. And so that's why it's taking longer for the gold price to hit 5,000. But I think now, based on all the money that we've printed since I made that forecast, and all the money that we're likely to print over the next few years, 5,000 is low. I think the price of gold is going much higher, 10,000, 20,000. It's going to be a much higher price because it's not really the price of gold that we're measuring. It's the value of the dollar. Gold is real money, right? Gold is fixed. The dollar is what changes because they can just print as many dollars as they want. And so as they print more and more money, we're not mining the gold as fast as they're printing money. So as they keep printing money and the supply of money grows and the supply of gold really doesn't grow very much, you now need more and more dollars to buy an ounce of gold. And so it's the dollar that's losing value, not gold that's gaining it. Gold is just staying still. You just need more dollars that have less value to buy the same amount of gold.
Okay, well, in 2018, the whole Occupy Wall Street phenomenon happened. And you actually, and you have this video on your YouTube channel, you show up in your suit in the middle of the whole Occupy Wall Street gathering with a big sign that says, "I am the 1%, let's talk." And you were actually debating with people about, I guess, what you felt was the flaws in their theory in terms of the 99% and the whole eat the rich kind of thing that was happening at that point. Number one, did you feel any sense of danger at any point? Did you have armed security or anything else like that? Because things were getting fairly heated at certain times.
No, I didn't have any security. My brother was there with me. and there was a camera guy from Reason TV. But no, I mean, we didn't feel threatened at all. I mean, I think that's a big difference between back then and today. I don't think I could do that today in this toxic environment that we live in today. I think that violence may in fact have happened. But back then we were more civil. And, the reason I went down to Zuccotti Park, which was where the occupiers were protesting, was at the time, a lot of people were blaming Wall Street, blaming capitalism for the financial crisis and, the Great Recession. The government, of course, was trying to blame capitalism. They never want to accept responsibility. But I knew that it was the failure to have capitalism that was responsible. It was the central bank. It was the government and the Fed that together created the conditions that produced the bubble and then the ensuing crisis. That if we actually had a free market, if the market set interest rates and not the government, if we didn't have the government guaranteeing mortgages, if people could only borrow money to the extent that they could prove that they were good for the loans, right, we wouldn't have had this bubble and we wouldn't have had the huge recession when the bubble popped. So I wanted the people in Zuccotti Park to understand the source of the problems that they identified was government, not capitalism. And so they shouldn't have been on Wall Street. They should have been down on Pennsylvania Avenue. They should have been, protesting at the White House or at Congress, or they should have gone down to the Federal Reserve Building in D.C. and protested there. And that was the point that I was trying to make by going down there.
Well, let's talk about Bitcoin for a second. At what point did Bitcoin really get on your radar, and did you initially buy some?
Well, it got on my radar pretty early on. Maybe around 2010, 2011, people told me about it. So, and that's the only way I heard about it, was from people telling me. I mean, obviously it wasn't like in the news the way it is today. They weren't talking about it on TV nonstop like they do today. But in libertarian free market circles, there were some people that were playing around with it. And because I swim in those circles, right, I found out about it. And, I thought it was interesting, but ultimately, I always see long-term, and I saw the flaws and the reason why it would never actually work for the purposes that it had been created and what people were thinking. And I didn't buy it. But the mistake that I made in not buying it, I just did not see the potential that it would catch on, that so many people would be taken in by it and be fooled by it, such that, you could have this gigantic, pyramid, Ponzi, chain letter type of effect. But I had known in my career that I'd seen all sorts of crazy bubbles during the dot-com era and during, the real estate era, that, why couldn't we have a bubble in Bitcoin? And in fact, it wasn't just Bitcoin. One of the objections I had to Bitcoin when I first heard about it was that, well, what if somebody else comes up with another digital currency? What's to stop that from happening? I mean, there could be an unlimited number of these. And I was right about that. There's now over 11,000 of them. But the bubble has gotten so big that the market has been able to accommodate all of that supply because we've had all this demand. But to me, it's just another bubble. In fact, it's probably the biggest bubble when it comes to, how ridiculous it is, because I ultimately think that cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin, have no value at all. So at least real estate has some value. Stocks have some value. And that value, was overpriced in the market. But I don't see any value in these crypto tokens that can be created out of thin air in an indefinite number that actually don't have any real utility. All they are is a token that you can collect. And if you can find somebody who will buy it from you, you can sell it to them. But I think the rest of it, all the marketing, it's all a bunch of hype. And it's unfortunate because I do think a lot of people who are coming late to the party, and if you're buying Bitcoin now, you're not getting in on the ground floor. You're late. A lot of people are going to be left holding the bag. And unfortunately, I think what's going to happen is, again, the government's going to come in and say, we told you so. Capitalism is no good. We need more regulation to protect the consumer, to protect the investor. and it's ultimately going to create even more problems for the legitimate investment industry, making it even harder to serve the public.
Yeah, I mean, I've never been a big fan of Bitcoin or cryptocurrency in general. I've always been a big stock market investor. I mean, in fact, that's really how I made most of my wealth, was through public stocks. I've been doing it for 10 years now, nonstop. But when Bitcoin came around, the problem with me was that I couldn't see what I call the killer app for this new invention. Like, for example, when the Apple computer first came out, spreadsheets were the killer app. Here is something that you couldn't do anything else, you couldn't do on any other platform. People were doing it by paper. Changing a number would take you 3 days to redo all the calculations, when suddenly, you had the spreadsheet, you had the word processor, and so forth. I mean, with Bitcoin, you can make electronic payments with your credit card. You can make electronic payments through your bank. The one real advantage I see with Bitcoin is doing illegal transactions. And you can't really base a business on illegal transactions. Now, Bitcoin seems to have done pretty well over time. So it's not like I was particularly right or particularly wrong, but for me, it just wasn't the type of investment that I would do myself, because I only really invest, just like I don't invest in gold as opposed to a company, because I feel like a company generates money. Something like gold or Bitcoin really just sits there and waits for someone to pay a higher price for it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, when it comes to illegal transactions, there are other cryptocurrencies that do a better job than Bitcoin. And in fact, as Bitcoin becomes more popular, it actually becomes more regulated, and it becomes harder and more expensive to do the illegal transactions. So it's really only used to speculate. But there is a difference. When you say gold just sits there, it sits there preserving the value of a metal. See, this is what the Bitcoin community doesn't understand. Gold is a commodity, and it's a metal. It's the most useful metal in the world. And it's used for all sorts of things. I mean, one of the primary uses is for jewelry, but it's also used in electronics, in aerospace, in dentistry. It has very unique properties that other metals don't have. And so you need gold for certain applications. Now, the beauty of gold is it doesn't lose its properties over time. It doesn't decay. So I can have gold, and in 10 years, in 100 years, you can still use that gold for whatever you would have used it for today. It's not like it's going to rot or it's going to break down. So that's why it's a store of value, right? I'm storing that value for future use. So I don't have to use my gold now. I can use it, right? I have a gold watch that I'm wearing, but the beauty is if I got tired of this watch, I can melt it down and I can get the gold back and I can do something else with it. So it has value. And so do other commodities, but those other commodities don't work as well as money because you can't store them as easily as gold, and they may not, they may tarnish or decay over time, unlike gold that retains the property. See, the Bitcoin community doesn't understand. They think gold is worthless. It's not. It's very valuable. It's Bitcoin that's worthless. And, there's also a difference between stocks, right, and gold. When you own a stock, you own a piece of a business. That business operates and generates a profit, and you can get a dividend, or the company can use the profits to buy back shares, right? So it's a real business. When you own real estate, you own an asset. You can rent it out and collect rents. If I buy a bond, I get interest, right? Those are income-producing assets. Gold is not an income-producing asset. It is a commodity, like copper or wheat or corn, but it has different properties than those commodities that makes it a better store of value than those commodities. And it's better as money than dollars or euros or yen. Before we used these fiat currencies, instead of money, the world used gold as money. And gold was superior to use because it was more stable and it held its value over time. So we could make transactions, and I can agree to buy something and pay you over the course of years or even decades. And if we're transacting in gold, you have a high degree of confidence in the value of those future payments. But when I'm making contracts in fiat currencies, who knows what they're going to be worth in the future? They may not be worth anything because they have no intrinsic value. It's just all a confidence game.
Right. And I agree with you. I understand that gold is a commodity and it has an intrinsic value and so forth. I'm just saying that in terms of an investment, most times, when you take gold versus a company that's consistently profitable year after year, and you see where those investments are 10 years down the line, like I said, gold went from 1,000 to 1,800, which is not bad. That's an 80% increase. But in that same time, you put your money into an Amazon or a Netflix, it went up 20, 30 times.
Yeah, well,
but that's all I mean.
Yeah, well, but you don't want to call gold an investment because it's not an investment. Yeah. It's any more than if you took dollars and put them under your mattress, you wouldn't consider that an investment. You would say, well, I'm saving some dollars. So gold is an alternative form of savings, right? So instead of stuffing bills under your mattress, you can take some gold coins. It is not an investment. An investment generates a return. Gold doesn't do that, right? So stocks are an investment. And of course, the difference is you buy some of these stocks, the companies can go bankrupt. They can go to zero. So you could lose a lot of money investing. You're not going to lose in gold because you're not going to lose your gold. If you have an ounce of gold and you put it, under your mattress, that ounce of gold is not going anywhere. You don't have to worry about losing that ounce of gold. You're going to retain it. So it's a form of savings. It competes with dollars and euros and yen. It does not compete with Amazon or stocks. Those are investments, and those are more speculative, right? Because you can have stocks that are far more conservative in that they have lower PEs, they pay higher dividend yields. So maybe they don't have as much upside potential to go up, but they also have a lot less risk of going way down or going bankrupt.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're on the same page when it comes to that. Okay, well, at one point you actually did buy some Bitcoin, and then in January 19th of last year, you said that your Bitcoin wallet got corrupted and your password no longer works. So essentially, your whole investment is worthless.
Well, that's partially correct. I never bought any of those Bitcoin. They had been gifted to me, right? Some people had gifted me, and I didn't even have a whole Bitcoin, right? I had like a third of a Bitcoin. And, but one day I went into that wallet just to check it out, and I couldn't get back into it. And so I entered what I thought was my password, but was actually my PIN. And it didn't work anymore. And they said, you need the password. Well, the only thing I ever had was the PIN because a friend had set it up for me. And that's all they gave me, right? I never actually had the seed phrase or, the whole password. So I didn't know I didn't have that because all I had ever needed was this 4-digit PIN. And so when the PIN stopped working, I couldn't recover my Bitcoin. I even contacted the owners of the company where my wallet was, right? I think it was, Bitcoin.com or whatever. It was a big company where I had the wallet, and even they couldn't help me. It was like, look, either you have to guess your password or you're never going to get your coins. And so that is, the other risk of Bitcoin. I mean, obviously, if I forgot my PIN to my bank account, I can go to the bank, give them my ID, they'll give me a new PIN. I don't lose my bank deposit because I forgot my PIN. But you lose your Bitcoin. You forget that information, it's gone. And of course, if somebody steals it, like if somebody goes into my bank and they stole my ATM card, they got my PIN, they withdraw the money, I go down to the bank, they can have a camera or whatever, I prove it's fraud, they just give me my money back. But if someone steals your Bitcoin, they're gone, right? I mean, that's tough luck for you.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, there's been a bunch of stories of people who have forgotten their password. I mean, in your case, a third of a Bitcoin is about $15,000. Not a big deal for someone like yourself. But there's stories of people who literally have lost millions, sometimes even tens of millions, when they forgot their password.
Or they're stolen.
Sometimes people have... when people have been convicted of stealing Bitcoin and they refuse to give the password up, and there's nothing that the authorities could do to recover that money.
Right, but let's say, somebody is able to hack into your email or something, and they're able to get a password into your wallet or your trading app where your coins are, and then they get in there, and then they get the coins transferred out. by the time you notice that they've been stolen, there's no way to get them back. They're gone. So it's not just that you could lose them, that they could be stolen. And I'm sure over time, these crooks get more and more sophisticated and they come up with, better ways to steal your Bitcoin. Because as long as Bitcoin is very valuable in the market, people are going to try to steal it, right? They asked Willie Sutton, was the famous bank robber, hey, Willie, why do you rob banks? He said, well, that's where the money is. Well, right now, the money is in Bitcoin. And so people are looking to steal it. And so that's just another risk.
Well, you've said that you actually regret not becoming one of the Bitcoin billionaires, because early on you actually could have put 100,000 into Bitcoin, and these days it might be worth $1 billion.
Yeah, I mean, look, you'd have to be a fool not to regret it. Now that you know what happens, right? Hindsight is always 20/20. So knowing that Bitcoin is $50,000 a coin, and I knew about it when it was, less than 5 or 10, wherever it was back then. It's one of the best speculative opportunities that I failed to take advantage of. I mean, it's not the only one, right? I could go back, I should have bought all this Amazon when it first came out, or I should have bought, a lot of things I could have, would have, should have done, right? With the benefit of hindsight. Now, there were some things I did do that were smart. It's not like I missed out on every opportunity. I took advantage of some. I made money. I lost money. Overall, I did pretty good. But sure, it would have been nice to have caught the big train ride as well. But, there's no way of knowing, even if I had bought it way back then, would I have held on to it? I mean, given the fact that I've never believed in it, would I have been able to hold on to it without selling it? Now, is it possible that buying it and experiencing the initial gain could have clouded my judgment? Maybe I would have somehow believed in it simply because I was getting so rich and I would have been caught up in it. I mean, you don't know, right? Maybe, where my head would have been. So it's hard to go back and say, yeah, if I would have done that, I would be a billionaire. But I think it's interesting that the Bitcoin community tries to make a big deal out of this admission. Oh, Peter Schiff admits he was wrong. He regrets not buying Bitcoin, as if that somehow validates buying Bitcoin now. I mean, had I bought Bitcoin back then, I would definitely sell it now, right? Which is why I probably would have sold it earlier than now. But I think, just the way I regret not buying Bitcoin back then, in the future, people are going to regret not selling Bitcoin because they can sell it now for a lot of money. And obviously the price could go higher, but none of that matters if it eventually crashes. So let's say Bitcoin does go to 100,000 and then goes to zero. If you didn't sell any at 100,000, what difference does it make? Didn't make any difference. The only person it's going to make a difference to is the guy who bought it at 100,000.
Right. I mean, you've called Bitcoin, you've compared it to Tulip Mania, which was the first financial bubble in world history. And you said that Bitcoin could become such an enormous bubble that it would actually replace the term Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, well, everybody remembers Ponzi. I mean, Bernie Madoff, right, was the big Ponzi guy, in this generation. But the whole idea of a Ponzi scheme was named after Charles Ponzi, the first guy to pull it off in a big way. But yeah, I do think that in the future, because who remembers this little guy named Ponzi, and I think what's happening now is really a more modern version of what Ponzi did. And what's happening with Bitcoin, it is not a pure Ponzi. It's kind of like a hybrid of a Ponzi, a pyramid scheme, a chain letter. It really is like a modern version of an old crime playing out, in the digital age. So it's not that Bitcoin is gold 2.0, it's Ponzi 2.0, right? It's a Ponzi to a whole new level. And so I do think that in the future, schemes similar to this one, they'll say, oh, it's another Bitcoin scheme, right? That might be how Bitcoin is remembered, as a replacement for Ponzi. And I do think that when they scuttle bubbles, right, and the popular delusions and the madness of crowds, they won't have to go back to Holland in the 16th century. They can just go back to America and a lot of the world in the 21st century, and they can study Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies instead of, tulips.
To me, the scariest part about cryptocurrency is that how easily it could be manipulated by one individual completely legally. Like one tweet from Elon Musk sends this currency into unheard directions. And I remember a friend of mine who's really into cryptocurrency investment. He was telling me about how after Elon Musk, who initially was like the crypto darling because Tesla started to accept Bitcoin, when he announced that that Tesla's no longer taking Bitcoin, all these new coins started to pop up, one of which was called Fuck Elon Musk. It's an actual cryptocurrency called Fuck Elon Musk. Like I said, when it comes to these so-called investments, like the Fuck Elon Musk coin, or for example, the Dogecoin, which started out as a joke, which suddenly, because of all the hype around it, doubling, tripling, 10 times the value within a couple of days, it just makes me take a step back and say, I don't see any intrinsic value in these so-called investments, or even assets for that matter. So I just chose to kind of sit it out. Now, me financially, I'm okay. Like I have a good amount, in my investment portfolios where I'm not trying to double, triple my money. My main goal is to maintain what I have and to slowly grow it. I'm not trying to flip my money really quick. But I can understand for someone who is making $30,000 a year and they're seeing this as the way to get out of those financial conditions very quickly, how tempting it is to throw money that they may not even have into these very scary investments. And ultimately, I think it's not going to work out for 99% of the people out there.
Yeah, get rich quick schemes rarely do. And, a lot of the young people think us older guys are just a bunch of fools because we don't get it. But the reality is we've been around and we've seen this. And, this is not new, right? Just because the technology is new, it doesn't mean that the dynamic isn't old. I mean, I've seen these things come and go. And when you think you're going to get rich quickly, you generally end up going broke. And, the biggest joke about the whole thing is when you look at a Dogecoin that was started as a joke, it literally is no different than any of the ones that were started not as a joke. I mean, there's really no difference substantively between Dogecoin and Bitcoin. But all the Bitcoin guys make fun of Dogecoin because they say it was a joke. They don't get the joke because Bitcoin is a joke too. I mean, that's why it was created, to show how easy it is to replicate Bitcoin. Just because it has a different name, what difference does that make? It's still a cryptocurrency. I mean, it has the same utility as Bitcoin, which is zero. It doesn't have any actual value. It's not an asset like a stock or a bond or a piece of property that generates income. It's not a commodity like gold that could be used in industry. It's nothing. It can't be used for anything. All you can do is collect it. And why do people collect them? Not because they're beautiful to look at, but because they think they can sell the collection to a greater fool at a higher price. And sure, it works for a while until the bubble drops and a lot of people get caught holding the bag. And I would hope that the listeners to your podcast aren't among them. So, if you happen to own Bitcoin, sell. At least sell enough to get your money back so that you're gambling with the house's money. And so that if you lose, it's just the funny money that you lose. But don't put any real money into it. Don't put your retirement money into it. The only money should be there is the money that you would take to a casino and that you're willing to lose it all. Not the money that you want to invest, that you want to keep safe and grow over time. None of that money belongs in the crypto casino.
Well, a lot of people, when it comes to their views on Bitcoin, they refer to fiat currencies, which is something you've mentioned recently. Explain to everyone what a fiat currency is.
Sure. So there's two types of currencies. There's legitimate currency, and then there's a fiat currency. So a legitimate currency derives its value from the money that backs it up. So at one time, U.S. currency was backed by gold. In fact, the dollar was defined as a weight of gold or silver. So a dollar was actually silver or gold. Now, the government and eventually the Federal Reserve began issuing currency that was basically an IOU for gold. So the first Federal Reserve note said, this Federal Reserve note is redeemable in real money, gold or silver. And if you had a $10 bill, it didn't just say $10 on it. It said, this note is payable on demand, payable to the bearer on demand, $10. So the currency was an IOU for money. The money was gold and silver, which were dollars. Now, so when people want real currency, what gives it value is not the fact that it's a piece of paper. What gives it value is that you can turn that piece of paper in for actual gold, for actual money. Now, when the government basically abrogated those promises and went off the gold standard, they repudiated the promise to pay money for Federal Reserve notes. And Federal Reserve notes became a fiat currency. And what a fiat currency means is the currency is backed up by nothing. And so what gives a fiat currency value? Because real currency derives its value from the gold and silver that backs it up. Fiat currency derives its value from faith. People accept fiat currency because they believe that other people will accept it. Now, the government helps to drive that faith because if you want, you have to pay your taxes in fiat currency. So if you don't want to go to jail like my dad, you better collect that fiat currency to give it to the U.S. government every year because they demand it. But also, we have a whole system where you want to buy anything, you want to buy food, you need dollars. You want to pay your rent, your landlord wants dollars. You want to pay interest on your mortgage, the bank wants dollars. Everything is in dollars. So that creates, a use culture for the dollar. And people also have confidence that, if they have dollars, they're not going to lose their value overnight. Now, people know they're going to lose their value slowly over time, which is why you don't just keep a bunch of dollars under your mattress. But, you're not worried about your bank account collapsing in value between the time you deposit your paycheck and the time you pay your rent. So, it works to that degree. But the problem with Bitcoin is that it's really a fiat, cryptocurrency, in that Bitcoin derives its value from faith. It's just like people have faith in the dollar, they have faith in Bitcoin. And I think eventually faith in the dollar is going to go away, but I think faith in Bitcoin could go away much sooner because it's far more tenuous, because there's really nothing you can do with your Bitcoin. The grocer doesn't want Bitcoin. Your landlord doesn't want Bitcoin. The government doesn't take Bitcoin for taxes. It's just speculators who want Bitcoin, and they only want it because they think the price is going to go up. But when they stop thinking the price is going to go up, they're not going to want it. And then no one's going to want it, and then the price crashes.
Well, I mean, when you mention the U.S. as a fiat currency, in 2021, are there any countries that don't have fiat currency?
No, they're all fiat. And in fact, up until 1971, what happened is a lot of these currencies were backed by dollars, right? And the dollar was backed by gold. But before Bretton Woods, right, before we, made this deal with the world, and before Roosevelt basically took us off the gold standard initially or diminished it in 1933, all the world's currencies were backed by gold. So we used to have a sound monetary system. Now we have an unsound system based on fiat. That's why we have all these problems. That's why we have all these imbalances. That's why we have all these bubbles that pop. That's why you have central banks with 0% interest rates or negative interest rates. They're trying to keep this dying system alive, but it is so polluted and so corrupted, the free market, that we're dealing with these adverse consequences. One of them is this big disparity now between the very rich and everybody else. This would not occur under legitimate capitalism, but it is happening under this fiat-based system that we have.
Well, you've said, I think it was on Joe Rogan, that the dollar will implode. And I'll be honest, that sounded a little crazy to me. I mean, in my lifetime, seeing the dollar actually implode, my entire investment savings account suddenly be worth nothing, I personally don't see it. Do you really think in your lifetime you'll see the dollar implode?
Well, whether it goes to zero, that's a question. Maybe not, right? But let's say the dollar loses 90% of its value, right? That doesn't mean it's worthless, but it's worth 10 cents, relative to what it's worth today. Now, go back to the 1970s. when we first moved off the gold standard in 1971, during the ensuing 9 years, the dollar lost 70% of its value relative to the Deutschmark, the Swiss franc, the Japanese yen. It lost better than 90% of its value in terms of gold, because gold went from $35 an ounce to $800. So we already saw that during our lifetime. And what stopped that? What stopped the bleeding? It was the combination of Paul Volcker raising interest rates to 20% and Ronald Reagan with not only supporting the Fed with that tight money policy, but also trying to move the country, towards smaller government and less regulation and a lower tax system. So you had, that type of combination. Do you see that happening again? If the dollar starts to fall again, the way it did in the 1970s, if inflation starts to spiral again, the way it did then, and it's already higher now than it was, and it's getting worse, how could the Federal Reserve possibly take interest rates to 20% when they couldn't even take them to 2%? How are we going to get another Ronald Reagan when we just elected a Joe Biden? I mean, the country is so different than it was. I don't see how it's even possible to stop the bleeding once the wound opens up.
Well, you've said that you don't believe in a minimum wage at all in America.
I don't believe in a minimum wage anywhere. I mean, a minimum wages exist. It's just horrible policy. I mean, if you care about people, particularly lower skilled people, you wouldn't want to punish them with a minimum wage. I mean, the minimum wage basically is a law that limits the opportunity of people to gain employment, right? If you're a young person and you don't have a lot of skills, right? Because that's where the minimum wage comes in. I mean, if you have a lot of skills, the minimum wage is irrelevant, right? Because you're going to earn way more than a minimum wage. Where the minimum wage becomes a big barrier is when you're young and you don't have a lot of skills, and so you can't bring a lot of value to a prospective employer. So when you're trying to get your first job in particular, so that you can acquire more skills, so that you maybe can earn more money later on, that minimum wage is a barrier. So whatever that minimum wage is, that's the hurdle that you have to clear. So if there's no minimum wage, then you can take any job that you could get. But let's say the minimum wage is $10. Well, you have to go to an employer and you have to convince him that if he hires you or she hires you, that you will contribute more than $10 an hour of value to their business. Well, let's say you can only contribute $8 an hour of value. You're not going to get that job, because why would somebody hire you to lose money? Nobody is in business to lose money. Everybody has a business. They want to make money, and they only hire people who will help them make money. They're not going to hire people to help them lose money. But if I can deliver $8 of value, and if the minimum wage is only $6, hey, I can get a job and everybody wins. But the higher they make the minimum wage, the more people get priced out of the market. So we don't want a minimum wage. We want people to be free to take the best job they can get. We don't want to make a law that says, hey, if you like this job and you're willing to work for X amount of dollars, if that's better for you than unemployment, you should be able to make that choice as a free human being. The government takes away that choice, and so you're stuck in unemployment.
Well, I understand your point, and I have a staff of 15 people. Nobody gets even remotely minimum wage. All my staff is well paid. They have paid health insurance, dental, vision, paid time off, and so forth.
And that's not because you're like a great guy, right? It's because if you tried to pay the minimum wage, they would all quit. They wouldn't work for you.
Right.
Yeah. So
right.
it's the free market.
I have to stay competitive.
Yeah.
Yeah. I understand that if I pay people too low, they'll quit and find a higher paid, paying job. I get it. And I remember this was maybe 15 years ago. I was dating a girl from Indonesia. And at the time there was these protests. It was all in the media that the Nike plants in Indonesia weren't paying the workers a very high wage and so forth. So Nike ended up closing down all the plants. And I remember speaking to her about it and saying, so what do you think? She goes, well, now everyone's out of work. And, they went and found a place where they could manufacture what they want to manufacture at the price that they want to, they feel is fair in terms of paying.
What probably happened, right, to those unemployed Nike workers is they ended up taking their next best alternative, which was a lower paying job than the one they had at Nike. Because when Nike, opens up a factory, they don't go out into the streets, with guns and nets and grab people and force them to work. They just advertise the jobs. And if people come and accept those jobs at those wages, it's because that's the best job they can get. That's the highest wage anybody was willing to pay them. And so it's ridiculous for somebody to say in America that that's not a high enough wage. We don't even understand the cost of living over there, because you always have to look at wages relative to your living costs. What are the rents over there? What does food cost over there? We can't use our standards to say, oh, these people are underpaid. We don't know how far that money goes in their town. And of course, people are smart, right? They are not going to accept a job if there's a better alternative. They're going to take the best job they can find. And what we did is we took that away from them. And we forced them by getting on this moral high horse and pretending that we're so, much better. Oh, we're morally superior. We think this is terrible, right? And so now Nike, in order to, show how virtuous it is, it closes down that plant. And now all these people are in worse condition than before, but everybody feels good about themselves because, oh yes, see, they're no longer exploiting these people. So now they're earning even less money in a job that they'd rather not have, but now they don't have the option because Nike's gone.
Well, but I do feel that there is a role for government when it comes to, employment regulation. Like, for example, during the Industrial Revolution, when it was a complete free-for-all, you had children working 7 days a week, people working 80 hours without being paid overtime, dangerous work conditions and so forth. I feel that there is a role for government to take to set up, if not a minimum wage, then a minimum set of standards that every employer has to follow.
Again,
I have to deal, I have an HR person that has to deal with all the various compliance and make sure that everyone's treated fairly. And for example, I tell my employees, listen, you work 40 hours a week. Every hour you work after that, you get paid time and a half. Right, you get a certain number of, paid, sick leave days because that's what's required by the government. Now, I'll go ahead and add vacation days on top of that because I want to, because I have to stay competitive. But ultimately, a lot of people, when it comes to businesses, if they didn't have to do any of that, if they didn't have to give any paid vacation or sick days, if they could hire people that are 10 years old, if they could work people for 80 hours without paying overtime, based on human greed, that will probably happen.
Well, but based on human greed, it won't happen because, as you said, people are not going to accept these low-paying jobs if they have a higher-paying alternative. If people value vacations and they value certain benefits, then they'll bargain for those when they're looking for jobs. And, parents are not going to send their 10-year-olds to work unless they have no choice, right? Unless the alternative is they're going to starve to death. And so, is it better that your child starve or have a job? That was probably the circumstances that existed back then. And, a lot of people in the U.S., when, they started working in these, poor conditions in factories, it's because they left even poorer, more hazardous conditions on the farm. Work on the farm was, very difficult and very hazardous, and people chose to leave those jobs and take these factory jobs. So it wasn't like, it was a step down. If it was a step down, they wouldn't have taken the step. And it wasn't government or labor unions that resulted in children no longer having to work. At one time, women didn't have to work. I talked about my grandfather. My grandmother never had a job because my grandfather could support her. Now, if he couldn't support her, well, she would have worked. But, and back when men couldn't support their wives, they did work. And when they couldn't support their children worked. But as capitalism increased the productivity of labor by providing workers with tools, people became more productive. And that's what led to children no longer working. That's what shortened the work week and led to the weekend and led to fewer hours being worked. It was a natural consequence of capitalism improving the standard of living of everybody involved. It wasn't because of government. Government tried to take credit for it. If anything, government slows it down. We would have made even more progress, but for the government interference. But government always wants to take credit for the good things that capitalism does, and then they always want to blame capitalism for their own failures.
Well, I mean, you have things like insider trading and so forth. If there was no government regulation at all of this, you would have a financial mess.
No,
if people could just, in a pure capitalistic society where everything goes as long as it makes money, I don't know if I'm 100% for it.
It's probably, the insider trading laws probably make it worse. If we didn't have insider trading laws, the inside information would be disseminated much quickly into the marketplace and stock prices would adjust much quicker. The reason that you even have opportunities with insider trading is because it's illegal. And then you have a real incentive to try to trade on insider information. It's just like the war on drugs, right? If drugs were legal, right? If, not just marijuana, but cocaine or heroin, if all these drugs were legal, the prices would be much lower, and the quality would be much higher if they were manufactured in a legal environment. But because it's illegal, the price is very high, and that attracts a criminal element that now wants to make a profit selling illegal drugs. So you now have a big problem because the government, through laws, has created this huge opportunity for profit for people who are willing to break those laws. And so the kind of same thing happens with insider trading. And I think a lot of people who have been prosecuted for that are really not guilty. And the whole thing is ridiculous, I think. It's just a reason to have more government, bigger government. What I'm really concerned about is not the insider trading. Look at all these fools that are buying all these hyped up meme stocks, overpaying for stocks. I mean, that's where the money is going to be lost. I mean, hardly any money is going to be lost due to insider trading. But I do think that there are crimes that the government should prosecute. I mean, I'm not an anarchist. There are people who are, but I do believe that, fraud should be illegal. When you're talking about at the workplace, right? I don't think an employer should be negligent and expose their workers to risks that they don't know about. But there are a lot of jobs that are risky. And, you take a risky job, you get paid a lot more money for assuming that risk. I mean, there's a lot of risk working in a coal mine, but people do it despite the risk because they get paid a lot more than if they took a job that was safer. But, if there's an unknown risk that maybe your employer cut corners and didn't tell you about, oh yeah, government can come in and there can be punishments for doing that. But, to say that, an employer has to provide, a certain type of working experience. No, I mean, you sign on to that work experience. Going in, hey, this is the environment that I'm going to have to work in. Do I want to work in that environment? Is the pay high enough, for me to want to do it? Or am I going to look someplace else? Maybe I'll take a lower paying job, but that's not as hazardous. It's a more comfortable environment for me to work in, and there are people that, hey, I want vacations. I want flexibility in my schedule. This is all a trade-off. There are people that say, look, I don't care about vacations. Just pay me more money, right? I just want higher money. I don't want to take a vacation, right? These are choices that, adults should be able to make on their own. The government shouldn't force these decisions on them, at gunpoint.
Well, right now, we're still in the middle of the pandemic. I really thought by this time it'd be over. The last pandemic lasted about 1.5 years. We're now more than 1.5 years into it. And with the whole Delta variant, we're still in the middle of it. We had, the crash that you predicted in 2008, there was a government bailout for the banks, but not particularly for the people, which is what happened this time around. Now you've had multiple instances of not only stimulus checks going to people, but you also had the PPP loans that people don't have to pay back and so forth. You also have the moratorium on evictions. So there's a lot of people that haven't been paying rent this whole time. So you've thrown all this extra money into the monopoly board now for the last 1.5 years. And, I talked to people like jewelers that I know that said that their sales have been going through the roof. People that usually spend $200 are coming in buying $20,000 watches and so forth. And this has been going on for a while, but it's going to end sooner or later. At some point, there will be a last stimulus check. At some point, you have to pay your rent. And at some point, there'll be no more PPP loans. After all of that happens, as someone that's predicted the 2008 financial crisis, what do you think will happen in the long term?
Well, first of all, the greater problem isn't that those loans stop or that money stops, but that it continues because it's doing tremendous damage to the economy. This is an example too, where two wrongs don't make a right. We never should have bailed out any of the banks. I said that at the time. Any banks that fail, were going to fail. They should have been allowed to fail. And investors, should have lost money. They should not have been bailed out. And the same thing with the COVID. The government should not have been bailing out anybody. Now, I think, but for the supplemental unemployment benefits and the PPP loans and the moratoriums on rents and student loans, the public wouldn't have stood for this. The public wouldn't have allowed the government to order them not to work if they were going to be without a paycheck. It was only because the government said, hey, you can stay home and we're going to pay you anyway. In fact, we're going to give you more money to stay home than we used to earn when you worked. So the public was, okay, that's a great deal. But that was a bad deal for the economy. And I think if we took a better approach, we would have had a more sensible response to COVID. Maybe we would have done what Sweden did, which I think was a much better approach than the one that we have. And we're just doubling down on these mistakes now. But yes, all this money printing is a huge problem. Prices have just started to go up. This is not transitory inflation. This is protracted inflation. It's going to be far worse than the 1970s. And by the way, these rent moratoriums, not only are these things completely unconstitutional, but this is going to lead to surging rents, particularly for lower income housing, because eventually these moratoriums are going to end. A lot of these people who haven't paid rent in a year are going to get evicted. A lot of these properties are no longer going to be on the rental market because the landlords are going to be too afraid to rent them out because it's too dangerous. They're going to try to maybe convert them into condos and sell them, or maybe they'll use them themselves or just put them on Airbnb for short-term rentals. But those lower income people who manage to find a landlord willing to take a chance and rent to them, they're going to jack these rents way up because the landlords are going to have to make up for all the rent they didn't collect and for the potential that the government's going to declare another moratorium and they're going to stop paying. So this is, again, an example. The government comes in and screws up the housing market. It's going to lead to much higher prices for affordable housing, making it unaffordable. And now the government's going to say, oh, look, there's no affordable housing. We need some new government program to deal with this, when it's the government program that created the problem in the first place.
Well, according to the internet, you have a net worth of $70 million. Is that accurate? Not so accurate?
It was accurate at the time because where they got that number was from my Senate filing in 2010. So I had to, file my financial disclosures. And at the time, I think that's what it was. So that was, over a decade ago. And yeah, I mean, the number would be quite a bit higher today. I mean, I don't need to really discuss what it is, but, I have made money over the last 10 years. and so I have a higher net worth now. But, nobody really knows, right? All this stuff on the internet, like, unless you own public assets, nobody really can estimate, what your net worth is. I mean, people don't know what are in my accounts. They don't know what's in my brokerage account, or they don't know how much gold I might have. And they certainly don't know how to value private businesses that I may own. So, people could just guess. And I think most of the net worths, when you're celebrity net worths, I don't know who's guessing this stuff. But I would imagine it's as accurate as the number they're using for me.
Right.
Because, that's what somebody found at some point on the internet. And, they've just used it.
Well, a final question before I let you go. For everyone who's watching this right now, if they have a $10,000 savings, this is their life savings, and they're trying to figure out what to do with it. If they were to go to you for financial advice, what would you tell them to do with that $10,000 right now?
Yeah, well, first of all, because of government regulation, no business could accept the account of somebody that only has $10,000. When I first got started, I would take a $10,000 account. I can't take it anymore because the government has made it so expensive to take a $10,000 account that you actually lose money on those accounts. So that's why the firms now have much higher minimums. You need 50,000, you need 250,000. So people have to do it themselves because the government has made it too expensive to get professional help. But, just, for the purposes of, a podcast, and, my mutual funds are available on a lot of platforms at discount brokers. The minimum is only $2,500. So people can actually go online and do some research. They can go to europacificfunds.com and look at my funds. But to the extent that you have $10,000 that you don't need for a while, right? If you think you may need the money, to pay your rent or to buy groceries, just, put it in the bank. Unfortunately, inflation is going to erode it away. But if you have a longer time horizon, if it really is, hey, I got this 10 grand and I don't need it, I want to invest it, then I agree with what you said earlier. For the long run, I like stocks. I think that, publicly traded stocks. Now, that doesn't mean I like stocks at any price. I think most stocks today are overpriced. And so people could end up losing a lot of money because they're overpaying. So I'm trying to find stocks that I think represent good investment values based on time-tested ways of measuring value. And so I find values outside the United States. I like the emerging markets. I like companies that pay really good dividends, commodity, focused companies now because I'm very bullish on that sector. And I want to get out of the dollar. So that's what I would encourage people to do, and not even think about, hey, how many dollars do I have? Because that's going to be a moving target as far as what those dollars are worth. What people have to be cognizant of is their purchasing power. I want to have a portfolio. I want to have an investment account, savings, that I can buy things in the future. I want to put my money aside now. I want it to grow. So later in the future, I can draw on that account to buy things that I really want, right? Because nobody wants stocks. You want what you can buy with the dividends that the stocks pay you, or with the capital gains that you'll get when you eventually sell the stock. So stocks or any investment are a means to an end. What we want is more consumer goods. There's two ways we can get more consumer goods. We can work, get a job and earn money, or we can invest our money and have our money work for us. But ultimately, the goal is to get more money so you can buy more stuff. And so if you want to buy more stuff, it's your purchasing power. And that's why I think you got to stay away from the dollar, because the inflation tax, and that's really what inflation is, it's a tax. The way we're paying for all these new government programs is through money printing, i.e. inflation. And so everybody is going to get taxed. Everybody's savings, everybody's wages are going to be diminished in value to pay for all this new government spending. So to avoid that tax and to have a portfolio that grows in real terms so that your purchasing power is not only maintained, but enhanced, look to international stocks, and I think my mutual funds are a great way of doing it. You get professional management. I think we know what we're doing. We're picking, good companies that over the long run, I think are going to deliver superior returns. And they're also going to protect you from U.S. inflation and a weak dollar.
There you have it. Peter Schiff, truly appreciate you sharing your wisdom. As someone who's been doing it for a very long time, who has, a consistent track record of making money. I think that's really important. And, I'm 48 myself. You're 58 right now, if I'm right.
Yeah.
People like you and I, you've been doing it much longer than I have in terms of investment, but I think the most important thing, which you've shown here, is that if you consistently invest, if you're not chasing after whatever get-rich-quick scheme is happening right now, if you have a clear head and look at what's happened in the past in terms of, tried and true, solid investing techniques, you could do very well over time. And I definitely appreciate you sharing all your knowledge here.
All right. My pleasure. Thanks for helping me spread the word.
No doubt. Take care.
All right.
Peace.